Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here today, back in Amsterdam, one of my favorite cities. And yesterday, as I got to have a look around and a nice walk around, I was inspired again by yet new areas that have been popping up. And we're staying in this wonderful hotel that just embodies so much of kind of what we're here to talk about today. So, oh, there's one missing. There we go. Yeah, the self-made city. I think today I will concentrate a little bit more on the aspect of architecture. And it's really, I think when we today talk about housing and how dense our cities are getting, it's much more about how do we want to live in the future? And it's the solutions. It's not about building how much housing we're building and that we need to build it fast and that we need to house not only refugees, but offer an amazing amount of housing. We're talking about, most of the European cities are talking about 5,000 housing units a year that they need to provide, that they haven't provided in the past and now need to jump up to speed for all of the people moving into the inner city. So, and even moving to the cities in the first place. So I think it's not about, we need to talk about not only the numbers, but in our cities, we have 80% of our cities are already built. So we're not talking about expanding the cities. We have to be very clear. We're talking about making the inner cities better, that we try to find how we can densify our cities, but at the same time provide even better cities or spaces and places that make our cities even better by making them denser. So how do we do this? And can it be that we need to rethink the principles or the way that we've developed our cities in the past? Is it always the investors and the banks? Or do the people who actually live there have a say? And can we change the thought about how we do things on the small scale, where we have a person who's building a single family house that has an idea, goes to the bank and finances their own single family home? And can we bring this together in an urban scale so that basically the people who live there and the people who are working there, it's not only talking about living, we're talking about a mix of uses, living and working. And can we have them coming together to make the choices at the very beginning? So as we'll hear a lot more about today, and as we've seen already in the presentation, we have this happening on in a public scale, in the public realm. People taking over spaces. This happens to be karaoke in the Mauerpark in Berlin. Just one guy with his karaoke machine who changed. This was a park that was very underused, and with his karaoke machine, he basically has initiated an entire change of the use of this park. But also, as we see in many urban gardens, this is the Prinzessinnengarten in Berlin. But also, in jumping from the temporary use into something that is much more about the use of the buildings and the use of the spaces, we need to find ways in which we can have a say in what happens here. And this is a Tim and Jan Edler from Realities United, who, when they were students in Berlin just after the wall fell, things were kind of wild, wild east, cut a hole open in their roof and made it into a convertible. And that was the situation in Berlin. Of course, this is a photograph, if any of you know the very center of Berlin, near Hackischer Markt, this is a photograph from 2008. So you can see that there were a lot of leftover holes and spaces that still needed to be filled up, which fueled the idea that it's not only the investors, but we can start to take on these spaces by ourselves. So this is a group of people who got together. There were several families who actually knew each other, and they bought one little plot of land together and decided, well, they can stack their single-family houses on top of each other and start to make the different decisions by themselves. And this is what a lot of people were doing all at the same time. And without going too much into the history of things, it's all about that people missed on the market any kind of possibility to live the way they wanted to. the general things that were available just didn't suit their needs. And we find in so many cities that as soon as we don't fit the kind of notion of singles or two-person young incomes, that we just have to move out of the city to find what we need. So particularly families were wanting to live in the inner city in Berlin and looking for a better neighborhood, good neighbors, things that were affordable, but also could suit their needs and be long-term, adaptable on a long-term scale. And in doing so, hundreds and hundreds of these projects, literally over 300 projects have been built since about 2007. So not even, let's say, 10 years have gone by where over 300 projects have come about, and they've also changed the way that, the way that people work together. The positive kind of aspects of these projects have also influenced what investors have to build on the market. So they've so highly increased the quality of what has been built for the price of what's been built, that now investors also have had to build to higher quality to a lower price. So not entirely, but they've really influenced what's happened on the market. So what is interesting is how these projects affect the city and the urban scape around them. So are they projects that just keep to themselves, that just create spaces, ownership-based spaces for other people in the city? Is this just another way to create your own apartment? Well, looking at the kind of density of how this has happened in the city, you can also see the kind of how it spills over and makes good neighborhoods, or even adds improvement to neighborhoods. So what are those qualities, and how does this happen? So that's a little bit more of what I'd like to talk to you about today, and how this can change in scale, and how this can actually be something that can help us in densifying our city by bringing quality at the same time. So this is very bright. Look at the different kind of qualities that I had to look at, and studying many different buildings, and bringing it down to maybe, let's say, key principles of what we're looking for. Looking at that, very special old buildings need special people who really care about them in order to be able to breathe new life into them. We can see this in many different examples, but key is really that there's not just one kind of principle that a developer can use to come in and revitalize these spaces. It's a very, very specific kind of development that needs to be done with people who really care about them. So these are a couple of very successful projects in Berlin. The Ex-Rode-Fabrik and the Urban. It used to be a hospital. So, and the kinds of spaces that these make, I think this is really key, that when people start to come together, they to build a project, they already have to talk about sharing spaces, like where's the trash taken out and the stair house, and so how can these spaces be expanded? What can one share? And the kinds of spaces that one shares, particularly in the inner city, increase the quality of life enormously. So particularly if families come together and all have children, if you make a space for this to happen, a space for parties to happen in, not only can you rethink about how large your private spaces have to be, but you can also rethink how you structure your day. So in the afternoon, maybe if there's a space for children, only one adult needs to be there with the children, so you can take turns. I mean, there's a whole kind of infrastructure of family life that can be rethought, and that has enormous advantages to living in your single-family house outside of the city. So sharing green spaces, this one in a courtyard, I'll show the project later, but even opening up, and some projects have even provided public parks or pocket parks that add to the community. And with this kind of, we think about how we want to live in the city, nearly all of the projects have always had to think about how do we make these projects adaptable over time. So flexibility is not only talking about choice in the very beginning when you're building the project, but also about changing family structures, how we build the project to be able to be flexible and even expandable or retractable over time. This project particularly had some very special spaces, so being able to create a kind of oasis, own personal oasis within the project, but also here the project wasn't allowed to build balconies, and so of course they had to build balconies because as soon as you open it up, you have this beautiful street vista and view directly to the TV tower, so you can't miss that. So they rebelled against the city planning and made fold-out door balconies so they can open up the facade. So these are the kinds of decisions that people can make, and they're, of course, vested in the community that they live in, and really, I think, identify themselves there with the community and take on a lot of responsibility to make the community better. So they do this. All of the projects that I looked at, of course, are built to a really high ecological standard, but even go beyond the extremely high German ecological standards, building passive buildings to the passive house standards, or Energy Plus, testing new kinds of construction with all wooden construction, or on this side, this is a more kind of temporary changing kind of experimental construction. This is by Arno Brantelhuber. Looking at how we can rethink spaces. Do we need to have the circulation on the interior? Can we save by putting it on the exterior? Rethinking, also taking on the responsibility to make sure that there is a mix of uses in the buildings, that our ground floors don't turn into parking lots, which is very easy. It's very difficult to find financing for mixed use because the banks always look at the Gewerbe, what's it's called in English, the shops on the ground floor, as a totally different kind of financing model. So how and with which models can we actually make sure that mixed use happens and that our streetscape is kept lively, and that it's not only about, it's about creating a city that where whenever you step out of the house, you can find whatever you need within the next 5 minutes. And in order to do so, we have to make sure that we bring together all these different kinds of uses. And this project does it by not only having a kind of housing at the top, which is flexible, that works with a kind of modular system where you can have 80 square meters plus 40 square meters, and always be able to break this off at a later date. So that you have adaptability in the future. But in this area of the building, they have a kind of a maisonette, two-story space that is very flexibly used for work or living. And on the ground floor, they even have an experimental room where they have different artists' installations. So in this way, their goal was to give something back to the city. And this is how that two-story space is used for short-term living or as an office space, and the installation and the shops on the ground floor. So this little hybrid in the city is a kind of module and a model, I think, of course we see it here everywhere, but particularly when we're building in areas of the city where at the very beginning there might not be a lot going on the ground floor, we have to make an effort, maybe together with city planning, to make sure that there's a mix of use happening on the ground floor. It's, I think, key to the development of our cities in the future. And of course, when you have people making the decisions about what is going to be built, how it's going to be built, and what to spend money on and what to save on, you have an entirely different kind of decision-making process looking at the long-term needs. And in Berlin, this has gone from a very small kind of development as it started out, it's a little infill building with only a couple flats, to very large-scale projects. So now there are projects being built of over 400 plus units, whole areas of the city being developed in this way. So, and whereas normally in normal developments there's only about 6.5 4% of families living in the buildings, so quite a small number. These kinds of projects have around just an average of 50% of families. So, but there are also projects that have taken on really high social goals. That have there are projects for also very specific kinds of people who, again, don't, not only families but other kinds of people who don't find their place in the normal market or alternative ways of life. So here, looking at a very small project. And looking at it, a very large project is the one that I wrote about in the conference newspaper. And having a look at how these projects have expanded in size, we can see how this kind of small infill project works, where the idea behind that was, okay, we're family, we don't want to move outside of the city, so how can we create our little oasis in the city by stacking the top floors having the roof terrace and the bottom floors having more of a direct access to the garden. And so these people came together and decided, okay, well, how do we divide up this kind of 5-story building, 6-story building, and how can we divide the costs? So again, this it not being 4, but then they took on 6 people, so we have a flexible unit in the beginning. It turned out that the investors or the people buying the middle floor were actually the people that built on the top and on the bottom, and they built the middle floor as a in-law suite, so they were renting it out in the meantime, and they're thinking that, you know, whenever their parents get older, they can have them come and live there in the same building. So we'll see if that happens, but in the meantime, they actually invested in their own building. So what they actually share is then later the land, the cost of the land. Of course, they built the site, they bought the site together, and they built a little summer house, a summer kitchen garden in the back, in the garden. So after the project is finished, they've divided up the ownership in this way. So this is a kind of a typology that looks at the row house. So let's say more common to you here in the Netherlands. But looking at how they divide this up, of course, you have the land. But what they did was they put the parking, and this makes a huge difference, as you all know. They removed the parking from in front of the buildings and put it on the side along with the trash. So not every... This is huge, actually. So not every one of the buildings has their car and their trash right in front, but they've moved it to the side. So again, this is what it looks like then on the side, but quite nice units. This is actually a garden view. Sorry, since it was about the typologies, I didn't include too much of the architecture here. So bringing these two typologies together, I think, is something that has... is a project that has won quite a lot of awards, but I'm going to show it, so you may have seen it before, but I'm going to show it in this way because it kind of unites this townhouse typology and the block typology to make a very urban, very dense situation. So what's happened here is that they have a very tight site that would have been 4 blocks, and so how can you create this kind of like nice garden atmosphere in the back that's safe, but still get a lot of light and still have a kind of very high quality spaces? So they have townhouses to the front, and they've stacked 2 3-story buildings, like split level units in the back. So this is the top of the townhouses to the front. The photograph is taken from the rooftop of the taller back building, looking over it into the rest of the city. Those are the townhouses to the front, to the street. Here's their interior courtyard. So they each have, this being the townhouses here, the taller part at the back. So they each have their little small terrace that spills out onto an area that is used by, I don't know, I think they have something like 45 children living here. So all of them kind of, they say that the doors are open, the kids come and go, and there's always, you know, there's always something happening and going on. So again, this is This is maybe the more interesting split level unit at the back where you come into the center part and go up to the living room area that then has another terrace on the very top. But this one, with great views to the city. And so all three of those typologies, or those maybe, let's say, smaller projects, even though they're not that small, have been very organized. The architects came up with the idea. They found the, let's say, investors meaning the people living there now, and they then set up a whole structure of a decision-making process. The architecture was very much in their hands. They suggested what it would be, and the people moving in, the people participating in the project, they all agreed with that. And the decisions that they made were much more about their own interiors, the process, the spaces that they would share. In this project, this is called the Ritterstraße. It was by 3 architects, a collaborative called Ivau and Jasko Faeser, together with Heide van Beckerath. And this infill project, filling in an area of the city that had been destroyed by the war, where there was a lot of after-war planning, let's say, tries to bring the building back to the street edge, tries to form more of an urban situation at the bottom. But they've gone through a whole kind of decision-making process. And I'm showing you this one to show you the kind of spectrum of the way these processes can be dealt with. And so it's not about just coming up with one way to go through this kind of building. It's much more about the variation and what you can, and the whole spectrum of how you can organize a project like this. So this is just a diagram looking at the processes that they went through and how they decided which spaces to share, how much to share, where these spaces should be. And in the end, I found they made a really interesting decision about, for example, their bathrooms and their kitchens. They decided to take on a standard kind of a standardization. So whereas the beginning projects, the earlier projects that I showed you, everyone living there wanted their own kitchen. They wanted finally to do it exactly the way they wanted, and they spent years at the Baumarkt looking at all of the faucets that they can choose and the tiles. So, and here they went the whole 360 degrees and said, well, if we standardize everything and everybody has the same one, we can save a lot of money. So, yeah, again, there's the whole range of what you can do and how you can save money. But they decided how they wanted to save it, and they decided what the standardization was going to be. And the architects also came up with a whole kind of script of possibilities about how they could choose the different modular facade elements and how they can deal with their interiors as well. But they made it also very flexible to be able to be changed. This is actually the apartment of one of the designers. The exterior spaces are all shared spaces. This building actually shares over 20% of its entire built surface as shared space. Not only the exterior spaces, but a very large, like upstairs, a roof terrace, as well as a kind of a family room that they have for the entire project that's also open to the community. And as a last project, I'd like to show you the Spreefeld that I wrote about, so that you have some images to go together with the text. This building along the riverside took on not only this kind of possibility to make a lot of decisions and decide for the people, and giving this kind of open structure that they work together with, but they also had the ideal to make it not an owned housing development. So it's not ownership based. They formed a new co-op association so that they would be able to enable people who weren't able to buy their own apartment the ability to live there. So that's, if you, yeah. So the ideal there is that the association is the owner, that they build it, then that the the people living there are members of the community. And so the membership, of course, is, there's a fee to be a member, and if you're living there, it's based on, of course, how much space you take up and how much space you're going to use. But they also developed an immense amount of shared spaces. They've created a kind of cross-financing principle to make sure that the people living, at the very top with the best views and the best spaces, that they pay a little bit more to enable lower-income families to be, or lower-income people to be able to participate in the project. There's also a really large amount of mixed-use spaces. This happens to be the shared space of the ground, but there are mixed-use, like 2 floors of mixed use, so they have not only housing, but a lot of different other kinds of spaces in the building. And they also had a whole kind of system of, where they built was actually the kind of beach bar area of Berlin. So what they didn't want to do as a community was to kick off the people who had already initiated this space and who had been using the space in the city in a very lively and wonderful way. They just didn't want to make them leave forever. So what they did was they made what they called option spaces, and they kind of cut them out of the framework of the building, which was built to a really high passive standard, of course, and very expensive. So they wanted to enable this kind of beach bar, low startup kind of people, a way to still come back and use that area of the city and breathe life into the waterfront still. All of the space at the bottom on the ground floor is completely publicly accessible. And through a kind of application process, people were able to apply for these spaces. So some of them are actually being used by the kinds of people who used to use those public spaces. So in this way, this project has really been able to, through all of these different mixed-use spaces and shared spaces, this is actually a cluster living kind of format. I won't go into too much detail about that, but what you see here is the empty site, and now this whole kind of wonderful waterway in the inner city had been entirely underused and planned as a kind of multimedia, like with just office buildings all the way up to the edge. So what they've done is created a precedent for what we need to think about when we're creating housing in the future, how we use our waterway and bringing the city and this mixed urban use publicly accessible all the way up to the waterfront. So I'll leave you with that today, and thank you very much.
These are such heartening examples, Kristien. I was thinking building this way is a wonderful way of keeping families in the city, but I thought, no, actually maybe it's the families who want to stay in the city who have initiated this way of working.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. Yeah.
So many cities are worried about families leaving because rents are rising and there's not enough space for the children, but this is really families taking the situation into their own hands. But 45 children, good heavens.
Not just one family. There are several families there.
That must make a lot of noise in the morning. I was interested when you say that it's hard to finance mixed use because housing generally has a different financing strategy than shops, for example. But in the example you showed, apparently it was successful. How did this work?
Yeah, there are several examples that were successful, but that one particularly, they formed a new company that encompasses the studio spaces. So there are 3 studio spaces, there are 2 studio spaces and 3 short-term living spaces, 2 shops, and the art space. And so it's a different company, and it indeed was separate from the housing.
So this is also a form of financial innovation?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things that you said that really struck me, and I'd like to talk about it with our panel later, is that by giving so much more quality for less money, these projects are forcing investors to work in a different way.
Yes, I mean, how do we change from the kind of social housing standards? And it always takes a few people who have a new idea about, I don't know, the open kitchen, let's say,
Shared space.
shared space.
Yeah.
You know, how do we want to live in the future? And it takes this kind of look at what we're doing, and that's why we're talking about it, to show these examples, because you can only do new things when you see good examples, right?
Exactly.
You know,
That's what Tony was telling us, showing by doing. Thank you very much, Kristien Ring, and we'll see you back at the panel later. Thanks so much.
Thank you.